is about to be executed at midnight. And the warden actually holds his ground and says to the Spectre, no, you cannot intervene in this case. The people of New York have found this man guilty of murder. And the Spectre says, very well then, if the people of New York have decided that this man should be sent to his death, then I shall judge all of the people of New York guilty, and they shall all die. And the inmate's attorney is a smart cookie, and she whispers only one word into the warden's ear, Vlatava. And the warden thus stops the execution from going forward. And we're left to presume that the inmate's death row sentence will be commuted. On top of that, the Spectre also goes out and finds that there was a lot of police corruption behind the framing and conviction of this particular inmate, and he slaughters all of those who were involved in the corruption and the cover-up. And again, Mandrake renders this so beautifully and horrifically, and we can really see that it's not entirely Jim who's motivating these actions. It's actually Jim trying to speak out against this, but the Spectre will hear none of it. And in his confusion, in his seeming inability to control the power of the Spectre, Jim does go to Father Kramer for guidance. And we see that Jim is quite angry about Nate looking into Jim's possible killing of not one but two women. And Jim pretty well admits that these two women did exist, and that something terrible did happen. But he's got a lot of rage against these two women who he reveals were in fact mother and daughter. And from his perspective, they're both lying and manipulative. Ostrander actually uses a pretty heavy word to refer to both women. Again, showing that Ostrander wasn't afraid to pull any punches, and editorial could see what he was doing in his efforts to craft a really powerful storyline. But in any event, Father Kramer questions Jim about this, and he eventually calls Jim out on his inability to be completely honest. Kramer says to Jim, I don't entirely see things your way. You're saying that you can't control the Spectre, but at the same time, you can't really control yourself. And that's the issue here. And you're trying to cover it up by putting the blame on other people. And this sets not so much Jim, but the Spectre into a rage. And we see once again, Jim loses control as the Spectre manifests itself and burns Father Kramer's hands pretty badly. And Jim doesn't even get a proper chance to apologize to Father Kramer before feeling the Spectre pulling him away somewhere else. And as it turns out, Nate has been investigating Jim, and he's found evidence at the precinct to suggest that Jim did in fact commit at least one murder, but any evidence against Jim was simply swept under the rug, and so Jim was free to carry on with his career as a policeman. But Nate won't let it lie there. Nate does some more digging, and he finds out that the young woman in the first dream was named Julia Edmonds. And he finds out that there is an address upstate for a Julia Edmonds. And so he goes to this house, and when he knocks on the door, a young woman comes to the door. and introduces herself as Alexandra, or Alex for short. She explains that she is Julia's granddaughter. She's staying with her grandmother because Julia is on her deathbed. She doesn't have much time left. And Alex understands why Nate is there. Alex explains that her late husband was a police officer. And so she'd like to accommodate Nate and bring him inside, but her grandmother is simply too weak. However, Julia asks for Nate to come in. She says that there's something that she's had on her mind for many years, and she wants to leave this mortal coil with a clear conscience. And so she asks Nate to come by her bedside, where she tells him about a pretty horrific tale from before Jim Corrigan became the Spectre. Julia reminisces that she was a young debutante, and Jim Corrigan entered her life as well as her mother's life as he was investigating the death of Mr. Edmonds. Jim Corrigan actually had grounds to believe that Mrs. Regina Edmonds had killed her husband in order to take the estate for herself. And some really neat artwork on Tom Mandrake's part showing just how much of a seductress Regina Edmonds is. Jim Corrigan looks like a little boy wearing his father's best suit in her presence at first, and Regina quickly seduced Jim, and they began a pretty illicit, passionate love affair. But then, Julia explains, Jim Corrigan also started wooing her, and she started wooing him too. She presented herself as the squeaky clean good girl in distress, and so here we see that Corrigan was a pretty randy fellow back in the day before he met Clarice Winston. And it actually lends credence to how Doug Munch portrayed Jim Corrigan back in his run on The Spectre. Julie explains that after a time she became resentful of the relationship between Jim and her mother. She was also angry with her mother to begin with. She felt that her mother killed her father, and she quite loved her father. So in her anger, one night when Jim and Regina were both in bed, Julia killed her mother and planted evidence to suggest that Jim killed Regina. But Julia explains the NYPD was an old boys club back then, and any evidence against Jim was swept under the rug, much like Nate deduced, and so Jim was free to carry on. Julia then explains that she went to the family bodyguard and told a woe is me tale about how Jim was beating her and threatening her life, and so the bodyguard took it upon himself to take Corrigan out. But Corrigan was wise to this, and he killed the bodyguard, ostensibly in self-defense. And then, as Nate saw it in his dream, Julia met Jim at the bridge, tried to pretend that it was all a giant misunderstanding and she had nothing to do with the attempt on Jim's life, but Jim went ahead and shot her, and she fell in the water. Now, Julia explains that she survived the fall into the water. She was brought upstream. When she came out of the water, she found it was a simple flesh wound which she got treated, and she saw this as a spiritual rebirth, as a baptism of sorts, and that in itself fits in very well with the Christian themes that we've seen so far in the Ostrander-Mandrake run. Julie explains that she assumed a new identity, lived a quiet life, started performing acts of kindness for people in the community, all the while trying to stay out of the limelight so that Jim would never find her. And then after she learned that Jim Corrigan had died, she went back to her home, hoping to reclaim her estate, only to find that everything had been sold off. And Julia explains that she was okay with this. She saw this as further confirmation of her rebirth. So she settled back down, married a good man, had a family, became a pillar of society, all the while keeping a low profile. She wasn't going out looking for fame or notoriety. She really wanted to atone for her earlier sins, and she wanted to make life for others that much better. And so now here she was on her deathbed, ready to die, and she was glad that she was able to make a full confession before leaving. So Nate leaves, and he and Alex decide that they will stay in touch. And Nate assures her that he's not going to pursue this any further, and he wishes Alex all the best. But then after he leaves, he realizes that due to his psychic connection to Jim Corrigan and the Spectre is basically on his way to kill Julia. And so he darts back to Julia's home. He's stopped along the way by the Spectre, who wants to re-enter Nate's body to recover. And Nate says, "Forget it, our partnership is done. I know the truth about you." He has to fight off the Spectre, and he manages to get back to the home. And he tells Alex, "We have to shutter all the windows, board up all the doors." And because the Spectre has made himself publicly visible, Alex doesn't doubt Nate, but their efforts are in vain, as the Spectre simply materializes near Julia's deathbed and begins to render vengeance upon her. And Nate says to Alex, "I have to kill your grandmother, Alex. It's the only way to ensure that the Spectre won't be able to subject her to a horrific end. He won't let things end quickly for her. I'm so sorry." And Alex says she understands. But Nate finds that he can't do it. He can't pull the trigger, but Alex says, "I can." And she wraps her finger around Nate's trigger finger, applies pressure, and a bullet is released, and it kills Julia instantly. And so the Spectre is now in an even greater rage. He's angry that Alex has denied him the opportunity to punish her grandmother, and so now he's going to punish her. And here's where we see that Nate and Alex make a really great couple for each other, as they both rail against the Spectre. And Nate says, "Leave her alone. She killed her grandmother because she loved her. You're killing people just because you're angry." And for her part, Alex says, "Spectre, who are you to judge people? Look at all the things that you have done in recent times. Perhaps you it is the one who should be judged. Perhaps you should go speak with your God." And this gives the Spectre a moment to pause and to reflect. And he says, "Yes, I must have a conversation with my Lord." And he disappears, leaving Nate and Alex and everyone behind. And this leads to a search for God by both Jim Corrigan and the Spectre as they reach the gates of heaven and find that there's no one and nothing there. The Spectre is actually able to walk through the gates of heaven because Michael is not there standing guard. There's only light and clouds, but nothing. God is gone. And so we see the Spectre appeal to Jim Corrigan, saying, "All right, we are reaching this tenuous stage in our relationship, but we must be one in order to find our Creator." And Jim agrees to this. And so there appears to be a temporary truce and a balance struck as the Spectre traverses both earth and heaven and hell in search of God. He goes back to the core of the earth and sees Gaia, who has been restored to her youth and vitality following the final night, and they have an interesting dialogue about how